In the process of translating ideas into words in our mind, very rarely do we consider the inner mechanics of that process. But when we start learning a second language, suddenly understanding those mechanics becomes very important. If there is a hole, if there is a gap in our understanding of the logic of a language, it becomes very difficult to speak that language naturally. In this video, I'm not going to talk about mistakes such as sensible versus sensitive or past simple instead of present perfect. Instead, we're going to consider the inner logic of the English language that may be different from the inner logic of your native language. Misconception number 1. Past perfect is only used to talk about a very distant past. Knights and dragons. The Pyramid of Giza had been built before I visited Egypt. That would be an example that many learners will give you when considering past perfect. In fact, past perfect does not necessarily have to do with very distant events. Instead, it could have to do with events that preceded other events just a minute ago or just a second ago. Did you hear what I had said before that? 2. Whenever there is a result, there is a compulsive need to use present perfect. That has to do with the fact that in many students' books and grammar books, we are told at levels where we study grammar books, namely intermediate, beginner, elementary, upper intermediate or something, that there is this aura of result and achievement surrounding present perfect. So every time there is that meaning of a result that we want to share with the other person, we feel compelled to resort to a present perfect situation, like I have finished the dinner before they came. Whereas the correct version is I finished the dinner before they came, or I had finished the dinner before they came. 3. Stative verbs never ever take on continuous. And I'm not even talking about things like feeling the radiator, I'm feeling the radiator, or how do you feel? I'm talking about situations when verbs that we normally associate with simple forms actually do take on the continuous, because that's how the speaker can get across a message that is in need of a continuous form. For instance, he picked up this idea somewhere and now he is believing it. We want to get across two things here when we're saying he's believing it right now. First, we mean that this is something that is occurring in his mind around this time. And secondly, we want to say that perhaps we're a little bit disapproving of that person's idea, or rather the fact that he is believing that idea very solidly. One thing to bear in mind having to do with the verbs as you progress is that your English, your sense of English becomes more fluid. And once you learn all rules, you can start breaking the rules, can't you? Speaking of present continuous, here is an interesting thing to consider. We may think that this continuousness only relates to the action that is in progress at this current moment in time. So it would not be very correct if we said, I'm reading something right now, because obviously I'm not reading, I'm recording this video, aren't I? But in fact, I might refer to something that I engage myself with in my own good time, when I'm free. For example, I'm reading something on quantum mechanics right now, and that would be a correct sentence. 5. Don't start your sentence with because. I don't know if it's a Ukrainian thing. Let me know in the comments. When I went to school in Kiev in Ukraine, we got told off for starting our sentences with because. And why is that? Because 6. Singular countable nouns should always be followed by an article. In fact, it is possible to say, shall we do salad today? Meaning that you are considering the idea of having some salad and you're using salad as a general term in this situation. Imagine your family is planning to get a pet, and an idea that you are considering is a choice between getting a hamster and getting a dog. And imagine a child walks in, they want to show how much they protest against the idea of getting some hamster. So they might say, I don't vote hamster, I vote dog. Here is another thing that has to do with articles. Very often when we know someone who we're talking about, we may feel inclined to use the definite article to talk about that thing or person. For instance, we might tell someone, I was visiting the friend yesterday at 5. Even though we know the friend, we might think that logic will be enough to justify the usage of the definite the. So instead of saying I was visiting a friend, we say I was visiting the friend. And the reason we give is that I know the friend. But the listener doesn't. One thing to bear in mind when dealing with articles is that it's a two-way street. You need to be aware of the reality that the other person who you're talking to, your conversation partner, has. And you need to make sure that everything you say is in alignment with that reality and the knowledge that that person holds about the situation that you are dealing with. In other words, it's really helpful if you can get into another person's head and look at the situation from their perspective. I have a more extensive video on that titled, What No One Tells You About Articles. Here is another one. Make, do, and have in collocations are fixed. As you're progressing, once again, as you're becoming advanced with your use of English, it's really critical to understand that it's okay to make your English more fluid. It's okay to give yourself room to play around with the language a little bit as you're moving on and becoming a more fluent speaker. For instance, as we mentioned in that example with, I don't want to vote hamster, I want to vote dog. It's okay to use make and do interchangeably with certain nouns depending on the context and the meaning that we want to put into that language. For instance, it's okay to say, I don't do cake. Imagine I'm someone who is trying to stay away from eating sugar, and my friend comes around and says, oh, okay, I've got us some wonderful cake. Shall we have it together? And then I might say, no, sorry, I don't do cake. Shall we have some vegan, raw brownies instead? You could say, I don't make cake, which would mean that your cooking skills necessary for making a cake are not high enough. But that is a different meaning. One thing that I want to share with you in this video is that the higher your level of English becomes, the more fluid your language becomes. You become free to create your own terms. You can coin your words if you feel that a word is lacking, or you may do so to find your way out of a situation where no word comes up. I want to encourage you to be more creative with your language, to not be afraid of violating some grammar rules, and to use the context to tell you what meaning you want to convey by what grammatical tools. Make the context your king. And having learned all those wonderful rules that have been very helpful on your way, make sure you don't allow those rules to hamper your progress.